they offered the Duke their jewel, the perfect daughter wrapped in silk and gold. But he didn't want her. He walked past the beauty and reached for the one they called a disgrace. "This one," he growled. "She leaves with me tonight." The porcelain teacup didn't just break. It exploded against Elara's cheek, spraying hot Earl Grey and jagged white shards across the stone floor. "You clumsy, invisible curse!" her mother's voice shrieked, sharp as the glass. Elara didn't flinch. She stood perfectly still, the sting of the tea beginning to throb, while her sister, Seraphina, draped in silk the colour of a summer sky, giggled behind a manicured hand. This was the Disgrace, the daughter kept in the shadows, the one who wore a rough wool tunic and smelled of the hearth and the stables, while the rest of the House of Vane lived on the fading fumes of their nobility. Her father didn't even look up from the overdue tax ledgers. To him, Elara wasn't a daughter. She was a structural defect in the family line, a smudge on a painting that everyone pretended wasn't there. She knelt to pick up the shards, her fingers grazing the jagged edge of a broken handle, blood welling in a bright, defiant crimson. The news arrived like a funeral bell disguised as an invitation. A black and gold carriage bearing the crest of an iron wolf rolled into their crumbling courtyard, kicking up dust that choked the dying rose bushes. The Duke of Malakor was coming. He was the man who held their debts, their lands, and their lives in a gloved hand. The rumour was simple. He wanted a wife to solidify his hold on the northern territories, and the House of Vane was desperate enough to sell. For 3 hours, the household became a frantic theatre. Elara was shoved into the kitchens, ordered to scrub the soot from the silver until her knuckles bled, while Seraphina was painted, laced, and perfumed into a masterpiece of aristocratic perfection. Through the narrow kitchen window, Elara watched the villagers pull their shutters closed. They feared the Duke. They called him the Iron King, a man who had traded his heart for a crown of scars. A sound vibrated through the floorboards, the slow, rhythmic thud of heavy boots on the grand staircase. Elara stood in the shadows of the servants' corridor, her breath hitching in her throat. She wasn't supposed to be here, but she was drawn to the coldness that seemed to bleed through the walls as he grew closer. The air in the manor changed. The smell of citrus and lavender perfume was swallowed by the scent of cold rain, old parchment, and something metallic, like a blade pulled from the forge. She crept toward the cracked door of the drawing room, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She saw her father standing by the fireplace, sweating through his waistcoat, and Seraphina posed like a delicate doll, her smile frozen and brittle. Then the heavy oak doors swung open, and the silence that followed was heavier than any scream. He didn't walk. He reclaimed the space. The Duke of Malakor was a tower of midnight black, his cloak sweeping the floor like a shadow. His face was a map of harsh angles, and a thin, silver scar cut across his left eyebrow, giving him the look of a man who had looked at death and found it boring. He didn't offer a greeting. He stood in the center of the room, his eyes cold, piercing grey, scanning the walls as if looking for the cracks in the foundation. "Duke Malakor," her father stammered, gesturing toward the shimmering Seraphina. "May I present my pride, my eldest, the jewel of—" The Duke held up a hand. A single leather-clad finger silenced the room. He didn't even look at the girl in the blue silk. He turned his head slowly, his nostrils flaring, his gaze fixating on the cracked servant's door where Elara hid. Elara frozen, her one bloody finger tucked into her apron, her face streaked with soot and the dried residue of the tea. The Duke stepped toward the door, ignoring the gasps of her parents. Every footstep sounded like a gavel hitting a block. He reached out, his hand gloved in black calfskin, and pushed the door wide. The tension was an electric wire stretched to the breaking point. Elara looked up, her eyes meeting his. She expected disgust. She expected him to turn away from the disgrace of the family. Instead, his grey eyes narrowed, tracing the line of the tea burn on her cheek, then moving down to her trembling, stained hands. He wasn't looking at a servant. He was looking at a person, something no one in this house had done for a decade. "This one," the Duke said. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to vibrate in Elara's very bones. It wasn't a question. It was a claim. Her father stepped forward, his face pale. "Your Grace, surely you jest. That is just the help, a stray. Seraphina is the one you came for. She is the beauty, the best we have to offer." The Duke didn't turn around. He reached out and, with a slow, deliberate movement, took Elara's blood-stained hand in his. The warmth of his palm through the leather sent a jolt of pure terror and recognition through her. He leaned in, his shadow swallowing her whole, the scent of the winter woods surrounding her. "I didn't come for a jewel," the Duke whispered, his voice intended only for her, sharp and dangerous as a hidden dagger. "I came for the one who knows how to survive the fire." He looked back at her father, his expression turning to stone. "Pack her things. She leaves with me tonight." Elara looked at her family, the shock on Seraphina's face, the horror in her mother's eyes, and then back to the man who held her hand. He wasn't saving her. He was taking her. And as he pulled her toward the door, she realized the look in his eyes wasn't just recognition. It was a warning. She had been chosen, not for a crown, but for a war she didn't yet understand. Elara sat huddled in the corner of the Yao, the Duke's obsidian black coach, her knees pressed against her chest. The interior smelled of expensive cedar and the faint, biting scent of gun oil. Across from her, the Duke sat motionless, a silhouette carved from the night itself. As the wheels churned through the mud of her father's estate, Elara looked out the window. She saw her mother standing on the porch, clutching a silk handkerchief, not in grief, but in a frantic, whispered conversation with the estate lawyer. They weren't losing a daughter. They were losing a liability. Her hand drifted to the small, lumpy pocket of her wool apron. Inside it is a small, blackened iron key. It didn't open any chest of gold or a secret garden. It was the key to the cellar where her father used to lock her when important guests arrived, so she wouldn't ruin the family's image. She had stolen it years ago, keeping it as a reminder that she was the only one who held the power to unlock her own mind. She squeezed it until bit into her palm, a familiar pain that grounded her as the manor house vanished into the fog. "You are holding that key as if it's a weapon," the Duke said, his voice cutting through the rattle of the carriage. Elara flinched, pulling her hand away. "It's nothing, Your Grace." He didn't look away, his grey eyes tracking the movement of her throat as she swallowed. "In my house, nothing is the only thing that will get you killed. If you value it, it has a name." This was the second interaction, the testing of the will. The carriage grew smaller, the air tighter. He wasn't comforting her, he was dissecting her. "It's a reminder," she whispered, her voice cracking, "of where I come from." The Duke leaned forward, the light of the swaying lantern outside casting flickering shadows across his scarred brow. "You come from a house of cowards who trade in flesh," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "I did not buy you to be a reminder of their failure. I bought you because you were the only thing in that house that wasn't for sale." He reached out, not to touch her, but to tap the glass of the window. "Look." Outside, the crumbling fences of the Vane estate had been replaced by high, jagged stone walls, topped with iron spikes. They were entering Malakor, a place of cold steel and silent, watchful eyes. The contrast was a physical weight. She had traded a cage of neglect for a fortress of mystery. Malakor Castle was a labyrinth of echoing stone and freezing draughts. Elara spent her first 3 days in a room larger than her family's entire ground floor, yet she felt smaller than ever. She was given dresses of heavy velvet and silk, but she kept her rough wool tunic folded beneath her pillow. The approach to her third meeting with the Duke happened in the library, a room that smelled of 1,000 years of dust and wisdom. She had been told to wait for him there. The silence was absolute, save for the rhythmic thud-thud of her own heart. She spent the hour tracing the spines of books she had never been allowed to read, her fingers trembling over titles of history and war. When the Duke entered, he didn't use the main door. He appeared from a shadow behind a massive oak desk, his coat discarded, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and faint, silvery lines from old battles. This was the third interaction. He found her standing on a ladder, reaching for a book on northern architecture. "You can read?" he asked, not with surprise, but with a calculated interest. Elara nearly fell, her hand catching the shelf. "My nursemaid taught me in secret. My father thought it was a waste of resources for a girl like me." The Duke walked toward her, the sound of his boots muffled by a thick Persian rug. He stopped at the base of the ladder, looking up. For the first time, the seeing moment began to flicker into existence. He didn't see the soot-stained girl or the disgrace. He saw the hunger in her eyes. "Your father is a fool who confuses value with glitter," he said. He reached up, his hand hovering near hers on the wood. The tension was different now. It wasn't the fear of a predator, but the heat of a spark. "My library is not for show, Elara. Every book here is a tool. Pick one." She pulled down a heavy, leather-bound volume on the history of the Iron Border. As she handed it to him, their fingers brushed. It was a brief, sensory shock. His skin was hot, a stark contrast to the cold stone of the castle. He looked at the book, then back at her. "A dry choice," he remarked, a ghost of a smile tugging at the corner of his scarred mouth. "But a necessary one if you intend to understand why people want me dead." He turned to leave, but paused at the door. "Tonight, you dine with me. Wear the blue velvet, not because I want you to be pretty, but because I want them to see what I have chosen." This left Elara leaning against the ladder, the smell of his rain-scented skin lingering in the air, her mind racing with the realization that in this house, knowledge was the only currency that mattered. Their approach to the dining hall felt like a march to a scaffold. Elara's reflection in the tall, gilded mirrors was unrecognizable. The blue velvet was the color of deep ocean water, and a silver comb held back her dark hair. But as she walked the long, torchlit corridor, she felt the hidden contrast sharply. Beneath the expensive fabric, her skin felt raw from the scrubbing of the servants. She felt like an intruder in a queen's skin. The sound of laughter and the clinking of crystal echoed from the hall. The Duke's advisors and local lords were gathered to see his prize. She reached the massive double doors, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The first contact with the room was a sensory overload, the smell of roasted stag, the blinding light of 100 candles, and the sudden, suffocating silence as she stepped inside. Every eye turned toward her. She saw the sneers, the whispered judgments. "This is the one? The soot girl?" She felt herself shrinking, her shoulders beginning to hunch, as they had for years at her father's table. But then, at the end of the long table, the Duke stood. He didn't speak. He simply watched her walk the length of the room. The interaction was a silent command. When she reached his side, he didn't offer her a chair. He pulled it out himself, a gesture that sent a shockwave of muttering through the guests. This was the power shift. As she sat, he leaned down, his lips brushing her ear as he spoke in a low, sharp tone. "Head up, Elara. They are not looking for a flaw in the dress. They are looking for a flaw in the soul. Do not give it to them." A lord to her left, a man with a nose like a hawk, leaned in with a cruel glint in his eye. "Tell us, Lady Elara, what does a girl from such a humble background find most striking about Malakor?" It was a trap, meant to expose her lack of breeding. Elara felt the old panic rising, but then she remembered the book from the library. She looked at the Duke, who was watching her with an unreadable expression, then back at the Lord. She said, her voice steadying. "In my father's house, everyone spoke because they were afraid of being forgotten. Here the walls are thick enough that only the truth needs to be loud." The Duke's hand stopped mid-air, his glass of wine inches from his lips. The table went dead silent. The aftermath of the comment was a slow, terrifying realization. She had just challenged a lord. But as she looked at the Duke, she didn't see anger. She saw something far more dangerous: pride. He set his glass down with a definitive clack. "It seems," the Duke said, looking around the table with eyes like flint, "that my wife-to-be understands this house better than some who have lived here for decades." But as he spoke, a servant leaned in, whispering a frantic message into his ear. The Duke's face drained of colour, his grip tightening on his knife until his knuckles turned white. He looked at Elara, a sudden, dark seed of doubt flickering in his gaze. "The border has been breached," he hissed, "and the leak came from the House of Vane." Elara was no longer just a guest or a bride. She was now a prime suspect. The silence in the Duke's study was not the peaceful kind. It was the silence of a tomb before the lid is hammered shut. Elara stood by the window, watching the rain lash against the iron-grey ramparts of Malakor. Behind her, the Duke sat at his desk, the letter from the border guard spread between them like a bloodied shroud. "The House of Vane has always been a nest of rats," the Duke said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "But rats usually steal grain, not military secrets." He didn't look at her. He was staring at the seal on the parchment, a wax stamp of the Vane rose, half crushed. The seed of doubt had sprouted. He began his investigation not with a shout, but with an observation of the blackened iron key. He noticed Elara's hand instinctively darting to her apron pocket, clutching that blackened iron key. "Show me," he commanded. He rose from his chair and walked toward her, his shadow stretching across the floor like a predator's. Elara felt the hidden contrast of her position. She was dressed in the Duke's silk, but she felt like the Disgrace again, cornered in a cellar. She pulled the key out, her palms sweaty. "It's just a key, Your Grace. I told you." He took it from her, his gloved fingers brushing hers. He held it up to the candlelight. "This is a key to a heavy lock. A cellar? Or a gate?" He stepped closer, his scent of rain and iron earth overwhelming her. The leak mentioned a specific mountain pass, a path only known to those who lived on the Vane estate. "My scouts found a girl's footprints near the old border post." He leaned down, his eyes searching hers for a flicker of betrayal. "They say the Disgrace of the House of Vane used to wander the woods at night to escape her father's belt. Tell me, Elara, did you wander far enough to meet the men who want my head?" The twist came with a sharp knock. A guard entered holding a damp satchel. "Your Grace, we found this hidden in the girl's room, under the floorboards. He dumped the contents on the desk. A stack of letters addressed to a known rebel leader, written in a hand that looked devastatingly like Elara's. She gasped, the air leaving her lungs. She had never seen them. "I didn't write those," she whispered. But the Duke's face had turned to ice. The aftermath was a cold realization. Someone back home hadn't just sold her. They had framed her as the fall girl for their treason. The energy shifted from the explosive tension of the study to the suffocating quiet of a prison. The Duke didn't throw Elara in the dungeon. That would be too simple. Instead, he placed her under house arrest in the North Tower, a gilded cage where the only sound was the wind howling through the arrow slits. While Elara paced her room, the Duke became a ghost in his own castle. He didn't sleep. He spent the night in the shadows of the servants' corridors, watching, listening. He was looking for the investigation trail. He observed how the head maid, a woman Elara's mother had recommended, avoided the North Tower. He watched the way the house Maestre's hands trembled when he spoke of the vain letters. In her room, Elara found her own seeing moment in the mirror. She wasn't the victim anymore. She realized that disgrace was a label they gave her so she wouldn't realize she was their greatest threat. She tore at the hem of her blue velvet dress, using a loose thread to pick the lock on her door. She didn't have her iron key, the Duke had kept it, but she had the memory of every lock she'd ever been forced to endure. She slipped out into the darkened hallway, her heart a drum. The interaction, happened near the Maestre's solar. She saw a flicker of movement, a shadow taller and broader than any servant. It was the Duke. He was following the Maestre, but he stopped when he saw Elara in the moonlight, her dress torn, her eyes fierce. "You should be in your room," he hissed, pinning her against the cold stone wall. "And you should be looking at the ink, not the name," she snapped back, her voice a sharp blade. "The letters use vein parchment, but the ink is oak gall. My father only uses cheap soot ink. He's too poor for anything else." The Duke's grip loosened. He looked at her, truly seeing the intelligence she had been forced to hide. But before he could speak, a scream rang out from the Maestre's room. They burst inside to find the Maestre dead, a vial of poison on the table, and a final note. "The disgrace has already paved the way." The stakes had just tripled. Elara was now the only living link to a conspiracy, and the Duke's court was calling for her execution. A narrow span of stone over a jagged gorge. The air was freezing, the sensory language thick with the smell of incoming snow and the distant roar of the river below. The energy was intense, shifting from the Duke's suspicion to a desperate, shared alliance. "They want your head on a spike by dawn," the Duke said, his cloak billowing around them like a raven's wings. He held out the blackened iron key. "Why did you keep this? Truly?" Elara looked at the gorge. "Because as long as I had it, I knew exactly which door was holding me back. I wasn't the disgrace because I was bad, Your Grace. I was the disgrace because I was the only one who saw how rot black my father's soul was. He didn't sell me to you to save the estate. He sold me to you to kill us both." She explained the secret trail, the mountain path. It wasn't a path for soldiers. It was a path for smugglers. Her father had been using it for years to fund his gambling. The investigation trail was now clear. The rebels weren't his allies. They were his creditors. As she spoke, an arrow hissed through the dark, thudding into the Duke's shoulder. He groaned, stumbling back toward the precipice. Elara didn't scream. She lunged forward, catching his weight, her small frame straining against his massive bulk. She looked into his eyes as he bled, the grey of his pupils blown wide with pain and shock. "Don't you dare die," she whispered. I won't be the girl who let the only man who looked at me fall. Run, Elara, he gasped. But she didn't run. She pulled his dagger from his belt and turned toward the shadows where the assassin lurked. The Duke was down, and the Disgrace was the only thing standing between him and the dark. The energy was explosive. Elara had dragged the Duke into a hidden alcove within the castle walls, a small masonry shed used for the forge. The sensory language was overwhelming. The heat of the dying embers, the smell of copper blood, and the rhythmic clink-cling of the cooling iron. She had to dig the arrow out. She used the iron key, the running symbol, to cauterize the wound, heating it in the forge until it glowed a terrifying orange. "Do it," the Duke commanded, his teeth bared. When the metal hit his skin, the tension reached a fever pitch. He didn't scream, but his hand crushed hers, his fingers bruising her skin. In that moment of agony, the seeing moment reached its peak. There was no Duke, no Disgrace, just two broken things trying to survive the night. "Why?" he wheezed, the wound smoking. "You could have let me fall. You would be free." "I have been free and invisible my whole life," she said, her voice trembling but certain. "I'd rather be a target by your side than a ghost in theirs." The Duke reached up with his uninjured arm and pulled her down, his hand cupping the back of her neck. He didn't kiss her. He pressed his forehead against hers, a silent, primal vow. "If we live through the night, Elara Vane, I will burn your father's house to the ground, and you will be the one to light the match." The aftermath was interrupted by the sound of the castle gates being smashed open. The seed of doubt had blossomed into a full coup. Her father wasn't waiting for the Duke to die of the wound. He had brought the creditors to the door to claim the castle. As the doors of the forge began to rattle under the weight of an axe, Elara realized the iron key was no longer a reminder of her prison. It was the only weapon she had left to reclaim her life. The grand hall of Malakor was no longer a place of silk and ceremony. It was a theatre of war. The smell of scorched wood and wet iron hung heavy in the air. The massive oak doors had been breached, hanging off their hinges like broken wings. In the centre of the room stood Elara's father, Lord Vane, flanked by a dozen mercenaries with eyes like hungry wolves. He looked out of place in his fine velvet coat, his face flushed with a desperate, greedy triumph. "Where is he?" her father bellowed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "Where is the great Iron Duke? I've come to collect what is owed, and I'll take this fortress as interest." From the darkness of the high gallery, a single figure emerged. The Duke. He walked with a limp, his arm bound in a blood-stained sling, but his presence was a physical weight that flattened the room's air. He didn't look like a dying man. He looked like an ancient god of the mountain, woken by the sound of vermin. Behind him, Elara stepped into the light. She was no longer wearing the blue velvet. She had stripped back down to her rough wool tunic, the iron key hanging from a cord around her neck, like a talisman. "You speak of debt, Vane." The Duke's voice was a low, terrifying growl. He stopped at the top of the grand staircase. "I have spent the night auditing your books, not the ones you showed the tax collectors, the ones you hid in the floorboards of your study." The interaction moved into the stage of the truth. The Duke held up a leather-bound ledger, its edges scorched. "This is the investigation trail, Lord Vane. It details every shipment of grain stolen from the crown, every bribe paid to the northern rebels, and most interestingly, the price you were paid to frame your own daughter for treason." Elara felt the heart-stopping silence. She looked at her father, waiting for a denial, for a flicker of parental love. Instead, Lord Vane's face contorted into a sneer. A disgrace is only useful if she can be spent, he spat. You were always a mistake, Elara, a smudge on the family name. If your death buys the survival of the House of Vane, then you've finally done something worthwhile. The explosion was not a sound, but a shift in Elara's soul. The years of feeling invisible, the years of being the disgrace who scrubbed the soot and took the blows, crystallized into a cold, diamond-hard rage. She stepped past the Duke, descending the stairs toward her father. Each step was a camera shot, her boots hitting the stone, the firelight catching the tears she refused to shed, the way her hand gripped the iron key. You called me a disgrace because I saw you, she said, her voice ringing out sharp and clear. You hated me because I was the only one in that house who didn't need a title to have a conscience. She stopped 10 feet from him, the mercenaries shifting uneasily as they looked from the wounded Duke to the small, fierce woman before them. You didn't sell me to the Duke to save your house. You sold me because you were afraid I would eventually tell the world who you really are. The Duke descended to stand behind her, his hand, the one that wasn't in a sling, resting on the hilt of his sword. I have seen enough, the Duke said. The evidence is here. The treason is yours, Vane. The mercenaries you brought? I've doubled their pay while you were talking. They work for Malakor now. The silence that followed was deafening. The mercenaries lowered their blades, turning their cold gazes towards the man who had hired them. Lord Vane's face went from red to a sickly, pale grey. He was a man who had gambled everything on a lie and watched the cards burn. But then the twist arrived. A shadow moved behind the Duke. Seraphina, the best daughter, stepped out from the darkness of a side archway. She wasn't crying. She held a small, silver pistol, a lady's weapon, but lethal at this range. She didn't point it at the Duke. She pointed it at Elara. If I can't have the crown of Malakor, no one will, Seraphina hissed, her beautiful face twisted into something unrecognizable. You were always the dirt beneath our feet, Elara. You don't get to be the queen. The shocking choice happened in a heartbeat. The Duke lunged to pull Elara back, but his wound slowed him. Elara didn't flinch. She didn't run. She stepped forward, closing the distance between her and the barrel of the gun. Do it, sister, Elara whispered, her eyes locked on Seraphina's. Show the Duke exactly what the best of our family looks like. Let him see the blood you're willing to spill for a title you didn't earn. Seraphina's finger tightened on the trigger. The Duke roared, his sword clearing its scabbard, a silver flash in the firelight. A shot rang out, a sharp, cracking thunder that filled the hall, followed by a spray of red against the white marble. Elara felt a coldness bloom in her chest, the world tilting as she looked down. The Duke's hand was outstretched, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated horror, the seeing moment now drenched in the terror of loss. As she began to fall, the last thing she saw was her father reaching for the ledger, still trying to save his secrets even as his daughter collapsed. She hit the floor, the iron key clattering against the stone, its metallic ring the final sound she heard, before the darkness claimed the room. The fate of the disgrace hung in the balance, a crimson stain spreading across the wool she had never been allowed to outgrow. The first thing Elara felt was not pain, but the rhythmic, steady thrum of a heartbeat. It wasn't her own. It was a deep, resonant vibration beneath her cheek, steady as the foundations of Malakor itself. She opened her eyes to a world of blurred amber and soft gold. The harsh, freezing draughts of the great hall were gone, replaced by the scent of beeswax, clean linen, and that unmistakable grounding aroma of rain-drenched earth. She was in the Duke's chambers. The massive bed felt like a cloud, but the weight on her chest was real. She looked down to see a thick bandage wrapping her shoulder. Seraphina's aim had been hurried by spite. The bullet had grazed her collarbone and buried itself in the heavy oak door behind her, but the shock and the blood loss had claimed her consciousness. "Stay still," a voice commanded. It was the Duke. He was sitting in a chair pulled close to the bedside, his own arm still in a sling, his face haggard and shadowed by several days of stubble. He looked like a man who had walked through hell and forgotten to come back. He didn't speak of the war or the debts. He reached out with his steady hand and brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead. "The Maestre says you will have a scar," he whispered, his grey eyes searching hers with a raw, terrifying vulnerability. "To match mine." "Where are they?" Elara's voice was a ghost of its former self, cracked and dry. The Duke's expression hardened into the iron mask she had first met in her father's drawing room. "Your father is in the oubliette. He will spend the rest of his life counting the stones of a cell he cannot unlock. Seraphina." He paused, his jaw tightening. "She has been exiled to the northern nunneries. She will wear the rough wool she mocked you for the rest of her days. She will be invisible, Elara, just as she tried to make you." The transformation began in that silence. Elara didn't feel the surge of triumph she expected. She felt a profound, hollow peace. She looked at her hands. They were clean. The soot was gone. The blood was washed away. But when she looked in the silver mirror beside the bed, she didn't see the Disgrace or the Soot Girl. She saw a woman who had stood before a loaded gun and didn't blink. She saw a survivor who had turned a duke's cold heart into a hearth. A few weeks later, the first snow of winter began to fall, dusting the ramparts of Malakor in a pristine, blinding white. Elara stood on the balcony, wrapped in a cloak of black fur that the Duke had draped over her shoulders himself. The approach was silent this time. She didn't need to hear his boots to know he was there. She felt the air change, the temperature rising simply because he stood behind her. "The lords are calling you the Iron Duchess," he said, his voice warm against the back of her neck. "They say you are more dangerous than I'm because you know how to bleed without crying." "I learned from the best," she replied, turning in his arms. The hidden contrast was finally resolved. They were no longer the powerful Duke and the powerless Disgrace. They were two scars that had found a way to heal together. The Duke reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object. He took Elara's hand, the one that had once been stained with tea and blood, and placed the blackened iron koi into her palm. It was the blackened iron key. But it had been cleaned, the soot polished away until it gleamed with a dull, honest silver. He had threaded it onto a chain of pure gold. "This is no longer the key to your father's cellar," he said, his eyes locking onto hers in the ultimate seeing moment. "And it is no longer a reminder of what you lost." He led her to the edge of the balcony, pointing down toward the sprawling village at the base of the castle. During the weeks of her recovery, he had ordered the construction of a new building, a library and a school, the first of its kind in the north. "That key opens the front doors of the Malakor Academy," he whispered. "You told me once that your father thought knowledge was a waste for a girl like you. I want you to be the one who proves him wrong. Every disgrace in this kingdom, every invisible child, every girl who thinks she is only worth what she can be sold for, they will find their way to those doors, and you will hold the key." The final image was a camera shot that pulled back from the balcony. It showed the high, jagged peaks of the mountains, the smoke rising peacefully from the village chimneys, and the two figures huddled together against the cold. Elara looked down at the key in her hand. It was cold metal, but it felt like fire. She leaned her head against the Duke's shoulder, watching the snow bury the old world. The disgrace was dead. The perfect daughter was forgotten. There was only Elara, the woman who had survived the fire to become the light. She gripped the key one last time, then tucked it beneath her cloak, resting it right against her heart, the only lock that truly mattered, and the only one that was finally, safely open.